So what I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about is kind of information and data and how you can use information and data in the context of a startup, and really take you on a tour of some of the things that I've been working on and interweave a little bit of my own experience. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I started my first company at age 14. That was a while ago now. I'm almost 30 years older than that now. You know, I really have been through a lot of different experiences with respect to startups. I started an ISP and hosting company, sold that in 2004. I've been doing a lot of work internationally since then, and as Vitaly said, my current startup is around email. It's called 410 Labs, and we'll take a look at some of the stuff we're doing there as well. But let's take a look at the concept of infographics. Now, you've probably seen things like this that go around the internet, and this, you know, some people might say, oh, it's a data visualization. Well, no, actually, this is really an infographic. And you can think of an infographic as a kind of illustration, you know, so they've got all these logos around here. It's all organized kind of by sector or whatever, but there wasn't any sort of algorithm or data that really went into this. This was sort of a human collection effort, and it's an editorial exercise. Things like this are really great for creating social objects that you can pass around to promote your startup. This was created by Brian Solis and Just3. They pretty much created this in order to promote some of the work that they do. So there's a purpose to things like this, but I wanted to differentiate between infographics and data visualization because they're really very different things. This is another interesting infographic that, again, you know, you're seeing things like numbers here that are represented in little balls and whatnot, and it's pretty. It's an interesting thing to look at, but an infographic, not a data visualization. So the point I want to make about visualization is that it should really convey information. And what is information? Information is something that you didn't already know. So one of the things that you see sometimes in data visualization is things like this. This alleges to be a map of all of the devices connected to the internet in the world. Well, there's a couple of problems with creating a map like that. First of which is that it's very difficult to actually get like latitude and longitude for devices connected to the internet. You know, people might think, oh, well, I can use the IP address and figure it out that way. No, you really can't, because the network wasn't built that way. And so, you know, the first thing you have to realize is that this is sort of wrong. And then the second thing that you want to take into consideration is that it doesn't really tell you anything very different from what you can learn from something like this. This is a map of the Earth at night taken from NASA satellites and stitched together. And what you kind of see is that there's a lot of population here and here, and based on the lights, less so in North Korea. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, you know, you really need to be thinking about, if you're going to put something out as data visualization, it needs to be something that's teaching you something new and allowing you to see in a new way. And similarly, you can see population density more or less correlates to that internet devices map. So new ways of seeing. What can we learn by looking at data and really seeing something afresh? This is a map that I made of my hometown in Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States. And this is a map of all the Twitter users in the city. Now, this is not a geographic map of any kind. This is a map showing communities. So this is an entirely new way to think about how a city or a region or a community functions. And the way that this works is it groups people by their shared relationships. So each little dot that you see here is a user account, and each line that you see sort of sketched in here is a relationship between those users, a follow relationship. And one of the interesting things that this kind of a map reveals about a city like mine is that it's quite segregated. The people on this end of the network barely have anything in common with the people on this end of the network. So I'm about there on the second E in geeks, and near the TEDx community, and there's a lot of startup-minded people here. But in our city and in our region, they tend not to know the people at the opposite end, which are mostly younger African-American folks who are not necessarily plugged into the technology scene and maybe less economically advantaged. This represents a real social problem for our city, and it's something that you can learn by using data to visualize a place in a new way. One thing that's interesting is that you see that sports acts as a connector between the two ends of the network, and you have things like Michael Phelps, the Olympic swimmer, and the Baltimore Ravens acting as connectors between these two very diverse communities. So in the context of startups, you can use this kind of technology to understand all sorts of interesting questions, one of which is to try to understand investors. This is a map of all of the investors on AngelList in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And you can see that people group together by kind of regions. So this group here is from Israel, and I think one of these is Turkey. I'm not sure. I think I had labels on this, but maybe they went away. But anyway, and these are like Russian ones here. So one of the things you can learn from this is really the scope of kind of the problem that you're trying to solve. If you're a startup that's trying to raise money, you really need to get a sense for how investors connect together. And this is something that you can do pretty readily using data straight out of the AngelList API. Likewise, this is all the investors in Asia. So you have a group for India over here, Singapore, Israel, Russia, Turkey, China. Dave McClure here is the 500-pound gorilla in the middle because he's invested in every deal on planet Earth. So you can look at also things like markets. One of the things that we were interested in was kind of the email market. So we got data from AngelList, and we wanted to see how our startup, which is right about here, fared in terms of centrality. One thing that the people who study network science tell us is that the more central something is to a network, the higher the chances that it's going to succeed in the long term. And that has to do with the number of connections that it has and the number of connections that are sort of inherited by being in that central position. But we wanted to compare ourselves to others, and we're pretty central. There's a lot of other players in this space, but we have a sense then of kind of how we fit into the context of the market in which we operate. And then you can do other interesting things like say, okay, let's take a look at combinations of markets like education and finance. I have a friend who has a company that's in that space, and I wanted to give her a sense of kind of where she fit in between those two markets. And her company's kind of down here, and there's a lot of other companies up here. I'm telling her you kind of want to get connected in further inside the network and move in that general direction. So it offers some real insight. And then lastly, this is a map of all the US investors on AngelList. And you get a real sense of kind of how they cluster. This over here is kind of people in New York, and then there's a Boston cluster, San Francisco, and then a lot of people who play in the middle. You can also use this sort of thing to understand employees. Using data from LinkedIn, I made a map of my city's entire employment landscape. So I can see what the biggest employers are. This is Johns Hopkins University, T. Rowe Price, a big financial firm, Legg Mason, another financial firm. But you can see that the firms cluster together. And so I could actually tell you from this data, if you work at a given company, I can tell you what your odds are of ending up at another company just based on the data contained in this graph. You can also use this to understand your users and what's going on with, say, specific customers that you have. This is a visualization that we made showing the interrelationship between some different email marketers that exist amongst our actual user base. And you can actually see that people who subscribe to Thrillist also probably subscribe to Amazon, which also subscribe to Living Social, and they might subscribe to Apple. And you can get a sense of the proportions with which those things co-occur. And then lastly, you can use data visualization thinking, kind of the design thinking that surrounds data visualization to think about new ways to develop products. This is something that we're working on right now, which is a real-time visualization of my inbox as of about 9 o'clock this morning. And these tiles are manipulable. I can move that all around, and I can actually see by volume who the biggest senders in my email box are. And it's only by approaching the problem from the standpoint of data visualization that we were able to come up with a truly original new concept for dealing with a problem as pervasive and as persistent as email. And then lastly, we talked a little bit earlier about what sort of problems you should be searching for as a startup. And one of the most important issues is the underlying why. Why are you trying to solve a problem? And making sure that you're solving a problem, that's really important. And when you start to look at things like this and start to understand your community in a really new way, you can start to discover some really interesting underlying whys. This is a map of San Francisco. And many of you may have been reading, if you follow the startup scene at all, about the massive influx of venture capital money and new startups in San Francisco has been creating a lot of pressure on the city. And you can see it right here. This is sort of a little cancer of geeks up here that's growing on San Francisco, and the rest of the city that's sort of trying to do its thing, and what it's always done is down here. There's even a group that's so clearly identifiable as to be clearly identifiable as Twitter employees. And that just jumps right out of something like this. Let's look at a couple of other examples. This is Istanbul, and I made this map a few months ago, and a couple of interesting things also jump out here. One of the most interesting things is that there is a group here of what I call young men, mostly frustrated young men, who really, really want girls to like them, and they write poetry to prove it. Now, you may wonder how I arrived at a conclusion like that about looking at this data. But by really sort of eavesdropping in on what these guys are saying and look at hashtags and links that they're sharing, it's very clear that these guys are about 17 to 21 years old, looking for girls, looking for jobs, and trying to find meaning in their lives. You can make a pretty strong argument that the future of a country like Turkey actually depends on what happens with these young men. And where do they end up? Do they end up going up here to become sort of part of the, tech, investor, politics kind of community, or do they go over here to the conservative religious right and become part of that world? Or do they become radicalized and join ISIS? That's the big open question. This turns out to be an army of troll bots that's reflecting information from the government back out to Twitter users. And then the other interesting thing that you see in the context of countries where they censor the internet is that you'll find things like this: sex generally, gay porn specifically. And it just kind of, for whatever reason, people, they turn to Twitter instead of using the open internet to find stuff like that. So you see that in a couple of different places. Also in Saudi Arabia, you see the little island of gay porn down here. And then again, religious quotes, establishment up here running as a kind of a spectrum from left to right, more liberal thinking and females down here along with a group of teenage girls. And then two competing football teams in the center, against sports acting as a kind of glue. You may have heard about the situation going on in St. Louis and Ferguson in the United States over the last few months. And so we wanted to get a sense of what the map of a city like that might look like. And you can see it's not dissimilar to Baltimore. There's a lot of divide between this end of the network, which tends to be very white, and this end of the network, which tends to be mostly African American. In the middle of this gulf right here, there's really no one. There's no one connecting the sort of Caucasian side of the network with the African American side of the network. And you can see, very clearly how the city is truly divided. Just to provide a little bit of contrast, this is Barcelona. And you can see that Barcelona is actually kind of a pretty balanced place. There's a big focus on Catalonian independence, as if you know anything about the current situation there, you would expect to see that. Also, FC Barcelona is very prominent. But then everything else is sort of in balance. There's people doing left-wing criticism, people writing about various cultural things, entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs over here, arts and culture, and then literature, with a nice mainstream media scene in the center. So, just for fun, I, over the last day or so, worked on this little visualization of Poland, and you find some interesting things. First off is that Warsaw is very clearly the most sort of dominant single place that I can find, at least in an early analysis of Twitter, but there's also a lot of other people that in the other major cities that are kind of connected together and forming a secondary community. Big sports presence here, mostly football. I was in Lithuania last week, and their sports presence was mostly basketball. And then in the middle here, you have male pop music fans. It seems to be some like heavy metal and death metal, that sort of thing. And then over here, we have teenage girls, Justin Bieber fans, specifically in this little sub-pocket. Even though I have a filter on the script to filter out Justin Bieber specifically, we still managed to let some in. And then One Direction fans down here, and then just more generic teenage girls down here. Interestingly, I saw the big agglomeration of teenage girls in Lithuania as well. And in talking to people, the kind of answer that I got was that folks that are living out in the more rural areas, they're more consuming. They're not necessarily participating in culture a lot. And so if you're a young girl, and you're living in that kind of an environment, you might be consuming a lot of pop music, and that might be Justin Bieber or One Direction. So what's the big underlying why here? Well, you heard Vitaly talking about the Maidan Revolution back in Ukraine, back in, 2012, 13? So you had this situation here. You had Gezi Park in Turkey. You had Tahrir Square in Cairo. All of these things were sort of premised on the idea that you could use social media to drive major social change. And sure, that's true. But without maps like that, without understanding the data and really knowing the extent to which a message might travel, the extent to which you need to reach out to armies of teenage girls, or to maybe use a different strategy, that's the kind of stuff that you can start to get at with this kind of data visualization. And the really tricky thing is that this kind of data that I use to produce this sorts of visualization and the similar kinds of data that we would like to have from Facebook or LinkedIn or what have you, is becoming harder to get rather than easier to get. The strategy that I use to get the Twitter data is kind of complicated. It took me years to figure it out. I was the first ever Twitter developer, so I had maybe some insights into how to do that. But to some extent, we need to start to think about how we're going to make this kind of data available to people. If you think about what you do when you follow someone or when you like them, you're contributing to a massive global data set that can, if used improperly, enable tyranny, right? And we need to make sure that that kind of data is available to you as citizens maybe first, but then also as startup and business people as well. What kinds of things could you make that could be useful to society if you had access to this kind of data? And frankly, we're still just at the very early stage of this. The big companies like Twitter and Facebook haven't even really started to think about what the social meaning of data like this is. And so I just want to kind of give you the thought that there's a lot of really important, meaningful things that you can do with this kind of data. Beyond just sharing cat pictures and selfies, there's things that you can do to change society here. And we can only do that if we start to demand access to the data in a way that's fair. So I want to encourage you in the context of, your own startup work. There's a lot of different tools available, and you should use them all. Some of the most popular ones that you can use to visualize very specific startup metric data are things like Mixpanel, Crashlytics, Kissmetrics, Google Analytics, Optimizely, Crazy Egg, big long list, and there's lots of places you can find resources like that. But I want to encourage you also to think about the fact that the sorts of data, the sorts of visualizations that those tools tend to produce things that look like this. And this happens to be from Crashlytics. But if you think about the tools that we have used to collect data historically over time, it's been things like logbooks. That was, if you're talking about going way back, say to the 1500s or things like that. We start out by writing down things in time series. And then, in the 1970s or so, we decided, we can put all that into a computer, and we can create relational databases, and we can maybe connect those things together in a way that's more interesting. But yet, still, we're producing the sorts of outputs and visualizations that are, very simple. They're, things that are line graphs, things that are bar graphs. We might have pie charts. But, all of those forms were sort of pioneered and perfected, decades ago, if not hundreds of years ago. We are now living in a time where we have new tools, new algorithms, faster computers that can enable us to produce entirely new ways of seeing. So instead of thinking about, say, like, intrusion detection on a set of computers, rather than thinking about that as like log file analysis, think about what you can produce in terms of data visualization that will allow aberrations to leap off the screen at a human and make new kinds of tools using the affordances of all the different types of technology that we now have available. Even things like the mobile phone. We now have these incredibly high-resolution touchscreen devices in our pockets, and we have barely scratched the surface of it. They're color and they're touch sensitive. I mean, what can we do using that is different from what we have traditionally done? And when you think about email and stuff, we're barely using color and touch to manipulate those kinds of things. Just as a thought exercise, what could you do with an Oculus Rift as a user interface? Could you create new types of business applications that allow you to fly and soar through data, seeing patterns as they emerge, and be able to create competitive intelligence that way? So I just want to encourage you to break out of your traditional thinking around what constitutes data, what constitutes data visualization, and to use the affordances of all of the new tools that we have available. So think about the nature of your data. What kind of data is it? Is it time series data? Is it network data? What kind of algorithms can you apply to the data that you're collecting? Could you maybe reframe a problem that has traditionally been seen only as a time series problem as a network problem? Because if so, there's a lot of different types of data visualization tools that you can apply to a problem like that if you can reframe it in a new way. So it's all about information at the end of the day, right? It's all about what can you learn that's different from what you already knew. And there are so many new tools available for you to be able to kind of see things in a different way. There are undoubtedly insights that you can unlock if you start to look at the things that you understand well through the lens of these new tools. So if you're interested in getting involved in some of the graph visualization that I've shown here, there's some interesting tools that you can get for free. One of which is called Gephi, GEPHI.org. That's an open source package that runs on Linux, Windows, and Mac. And then D3.org has a tremendous array of JavaScript-based visualization tools. Sigma.js is a good JavaScript-based graph visualization tool. And then there's another interesting one called biofabric.org. And again, just want to encourage you that not everything needs to be a bar or line graph or pie chart. There are lots of different ways to see data and to see things differently, and each one provides some different insights. So if you'd like to contact me, this is how you can get in touch with me. Peoplemaps.org, I've got some information on the sort of place-based visualization stuff I've been doing, and my blog URL is davetroy.com, and our main product is called Maelstrom. I encourage everybody to check it out. We, as Vitaly said, help people process email a lot more efficiently right now on the web and then soon on iOS. And if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to talk with you after the break. So thanks again.
Thanks, Dave.